By Frederick Forsyth, Federico, for the Spanish, it has been said that he is the world's leading writer in his genre, that he is the maker of bestsellers that are sweeping the world with their print runs. How do you do it, Federico? Welcome. How do you manage to achieve that difficult level of creating a bestseller?
The first time, with Chacal, it was pure instinct, because I had no experience, I hadn't taken lessons or courses or anything. In 1970, I was a journalist, 12 years in journalism, without a job, with no prospects of getting a job and without much money. It seemed useful to me instead of wasting my time, trying to earn, as I considered it, a few bucks by writing a novel. I had no hope of success like it was, but I thought I would have a modest success in England with this novel Chacal. I wrote it then in the way that seemed most interesting, logical, and chronological to me, and in a style that is not exactly literary. It is a dry style, a journalistic reporter's style. Journalistic. And boom, success, many copies sold and more ordered and more ordered and more ordered, and now they tell me, he is a new genius. I don't know how. Instinct.
After that first novel, others have followed that have also been bestsellers. Instinct has acquired, in addition to instinct, it has been strengthened by some other means. It was necessary when my English publishers and I, when we could see the success of this, to do an analysis, a sort of analysis. Why? How? And more importantly, can I do it a second time? Because there are many first novels that are good and nothing more.
Many writers of only one book.
Yes. So, this analysis of the Jackal, I learned the following, which is that you have to write a fairly interesting narrative, contemporary, topical, with lots of technological, technical, procedural details, and show the reader what happens behind.
The curtains.
What happens in the corridors of power and also in the bars of the lamp. And then I wrote Odessa, not the same theme, but the same type, manhunt, criminals, spies and such. And finally, the buts, the War of the Three, the new one, of course, is different. But I think that now, 10 years later, I do have a formula. It's not just instinct, it's more thought out. It
gives the impression that your novels are a bit like the product of a laboratory, as if you had them very meticulously studied, resolved in all their complications until they ended in the unexpected ending, right? And the truth is that if there is a laboratory, this laboratory only exists here. My way of working is to develop the story, the plot of the novel. That's the first thing, and it can take a year and a half without writing a word. Only when I know exactly what the story is, how many characters there are, what they do, what they say, do I start looking for technical information. This part of the work involves traveling to Washington, Moscow, London, Rome, Stockholm, wherever. If I think that a man who is possibly the world's leading expert in this discipline lives in Stockholm, I go to Stockholm to see him, and only when I have all this information do I start writing, and when I write it quickly, because I'm not composing, I'm just dictating to my fingers what they should write.
Estoy solamente dictando a mis dedos lo que deben escribir.
It's clear that Forsyth doesn't start writing until he has the entire novel in his head.
Esto es, no, nunca empiezo
That is, I never start with question marks in my head.
interrogativas en mi cabeza. Yo debo conocer cada
I must know each character, each action, where it takes place, whether it's Jerusalem or New York, wherever, exactly what happens in each city.
exactamente lo que pasa en cada ciudad y los nudos
And the plots must not be random, everything is planned.
por casualidad. Todo es planificado.
So all the characters, their characters, the scenes, even the dialogues, the settings, everything is perfectly planned.
Yes,
Y por eso los
and that's why the characters
no
aren't
son
very deep,
profundos,
they're superficial.
son superficiales. Yo lo admito. Porque si yo
I admit it, because if I spent 100 pages describing a character in depth, it would be losing the rhythm of the action.
Sería por perder el ritmo de la acción. ¿Y qué es
And
lo
what's
que
the most important thing in a thriller?
En este genio de novela, en thriller,
In this genius of a novel, in a trailer, the action, the rhythm, the excitement for the reader must be king and the character's development is secondary.
el desarrollo es secundario. Entonces mi carácter no
So I don't spend much time describing my characters.
mis carácter.
Indeed, that is one of the criticisms critics have made, that Forsyth does not stop to make a psychic study of his characters, but rather presents them as nothing more than a sketch.
Sí, es una
Yes, it is a criticism, but I think it is a miscast criticism in the sense that I do not understand why he is doing this.
entiendo es hacer esto.
It is like saying, you, sir, make very good butter, but it is not marmalade.
Si el señor es
If the gentleman is making butter, leave him alone and make butter.
fabrica mantequilla.
Of course, what you want to do is exactly what you do. Yes, a thriller is a genius of a novel.
No es una novela psicológica, no es una novela romántica,
It is not a psychological novel. It is not a romantic novel. It is not a historical novel. It must fulfill a duty to excite, to grab the reader, to lead him, from page 1 to page 500 or whatever.
conducirlo de página 1 a página 500, que sea, y
And we hope that he wants to continue because the pace of the action pushes him to continue until the last page.
empuje a continuar hasta la última página. Con 100 páginas en el medio,
With 100 pages in between describing Mr. Smith's character, he could lose interest.
él podía perder interés.
In other words, the book, instead of winning, would lose. I think, yes, it would be a mix of two types.
Yes, of two different genres. This is the genre that you cultivate deep down. It is a genre that is characterized by an almost cinematic rhythm.
Yes,
Sí,
Yes, I agree.
where they are, it even seems that they are thought out. It is thought out in terms of the possibility that it will later be transferred to celluloid. No, it is not like the liberated one.
yo
I envision an action in my imagination.
mi imaginación.
You imagine it, you see it.
Esto es.
This is how it would be.
¿Cómo sería? Por ejemplo, en esto, yo
For
puedo
example,
cerrar
in this I can close my eyes and imagine a tanker, a million-ton supertanker.
de millón de toneladas.
A million-ton supertanker.
Esto es.
This is coming towards,
Desde el horizonte
as from the
a
horizon.
nosotros. Y si el director
And if the film director can see the same thing, so much the better.
tan mejor.
Some of your novels have been made into movies and have been as big bestsellers as your books were in bookstores. Do you think they have faithfully respected the ideas that you had?
S-
In the case of the Shackle, yes, yes.
Sí. No era yo, no era tan contento con Odessa.
Oh, no, I wasn't so happy with Odessa because it seemed to me that they had changed a lot without gaining from the changes. But Fred Cinnamon, who was the director of The Shackle, followed the story very closely, and I think there was a lot of tension in this film.
Pienso que era mucha tensión en esta película.
I liked it. When it is said that you are the #1 writer in this genre, do you agree with that or do you think there is someone better? It is always difficult to be your own judge. And also, the publishers of several
American and English writers, of course, are fans of their author. So each one says, no, no, mine has sold more than so and so.
Pero yo pienso que hay posiblemente un docen mundialmente.
But I think that there are probably a dozen worldwide, 6 Americans, 4 or 5 English, and 1 other, who can be considered the top in terms of copies sold. No, I'm not talking about quality. Literary quality is another thing, but in terms of copies sold, yes.
You have never set out to create literature in your books.
No, no. No, it's not my gift, you know? And I don't lie to myself. I'm not Shakespeare. I'm not Cervantes. I'm a thriller writer who does something to entertain a reader for a few hours by the pool on vacation, and my ambitions are
Not to reach the academies or the big break. In this book, however, Genesis of an African Legend, the story of Biafra, which is more of a book of reports, a journalistic book, you delve deeper into the analysis of the characters, you give us a more in-depth description of what each of them is like, and, in a way, you're, taking sides. There you're not acting in a neutral way like in the rest of the books, but as a witness who takes sides for something, right? But we have to consider one thing, it's the only one that's not fiction. It's the only one that's real. The first book I wrote about the history of Biafra was written 90% within the context of Biafra, completely contemporary. It was an angry book because it was angry because of what I saw, children dying in thousands and thousands. And of course, since it was a report, I had time to describe what happened and the characters. It didn't have a fictional plot, it didn't have a climax because there was no climax, it was just a story. Why did it take so long for that book to be published?
Which one? Biafra? No, it didn't take long. Here, at least. Oh, it
reached us here much later than the date it was written, perhaps. Too late. It was a decision made by the publishers. I think this book in English was released in '69, 2 years before Chacal. You wrote it in '69, didn't you? '69. You were in a trailer in January '69 and it was published in June. But I don't think it was. It sold 30,000 copies in paperback and then it disappeared because Biafra had also disappeared and much of the interest had disappeared. Years later it was possible to discuss Biafra, which was not possible during or in the months after.
Of course. There were pressures not to discuss this issue. And so that book that you had written 2 years earlier, you finished it, so to speak, by adding new chapters, right?
Yes. And the history of Biafra, the first version, I couldn't finish because the war was always going on.
Yes.
So you returned to Biafra in the fall of '69 to write the story from April to the end of December. And by chance, the end of December was also the end of Biafra. So the story could end with a climax, the exile of the leader General Oyuku and the end of the war. It seems that this character is a character that you have always liked, that has attracted you. It seems that General Oyuku is a character who has somehow impressed you, who has fascinated you.
A lot.
Yo he visto muchos políticos en 12
I have seen many politicians in 12 years of journalism, and most of them as correspondents in foreign countries and as political journalists.
periodistas de periodismo político. Y visto
I have seen many politicians and many leaders, dictators, prime ministers, and so on.
muy pocos.
Very, very few have inspired my adoration for their integrity, for their courage, for their intelligence, for their honesty.
Por su honestidad. Unos, David Ben-Gurion,
Ah, David Ben-Gurion of Israel was a leader, one of the few who could go out into the marketplace among the people without putting on makeup.
la gente sin maquillarse.
Without faking his truth. Yes.
Ah,
Ah, an impressive man.
este negro barbudo era un otro.
This bearded black man was yet another talent for what they knew, for what they detested him for.
Ellos lo sabían. Para eso que le detestaban.
You said earlier that in the book you try to give the reader a little bit of those things that are so distant for him, which is to know the intricacies of power, the conspiracies, the machinations that always surround the atmosphere where big decisions are made. Have you had access to those areas of power? Sometimes,
Yo estaba testigo a un
I witnessed some events, sometimes I know they're in the past, but I wasn't there.
Yo sé que son pasado, pero yo no estaba. En estos casos lo que hago es de encontrar, de buscar.
In these cases, what I do is find, look for someone who was possibly retired from work and talk to them, asking them, tell me, what was it like?
Charlar con él, pidiéndolo, dígame, ¿cómo fue?
How were you? What happened that day? Were you there? Wasn't I there? Tell me, how were you?
Encuentro que es más informativo.
And I find it more informative to talk to a back guard, for example, who was in this situation, to search through files.
Esta situación, que buscar en archivos. Archivos son muy secos.
Files are very dry, they say such and such and such, but the person who was there can say, look, Freddy, I remember it was very, very hot, extremely hot.
Extraordinario.
I remember this and that. Quote, small details.
Estos detalles dan una
Those
impresión
details give an
más
impression of the truth more than a list of statistics,
de lista de estadísticas.
more than a cold document.
Esto.
Speaking of documents, it has been said, yes, of course, you can do whatever you want. It has been said that Frederick Forsyth always gathers an enormous amount of documentation on each case, on each novel, and that the documents are so important that he has sometimes had to submit them to the custody of a notary. That is true.
Yo tengo mucho menos.
I have much less documentation than you might imagine.
Yo traigo
I carry most of my information in my head.
Tengo un libro de direcciones.
I have an address book that could have some value because there are statesmen, mercenaries, a bit of everything in it.
Mercenarios, un poco de todo dentro. Solamente una vez yo calculaba necesario.
Only once, I thought it was necessary to take some information and advise my lawyer, who has a very impressive safe below his office.
Una caja fuerte, muy impresionante, abajo de su oficina. Y hasta hoy,
And this dossier remains inside until today.
ahí dentro.
We are going to tell you now who Frederick Forsyth is, apart from being the author of the most famous books of the time. He was born in Ashford, Kent County, southeast England, on August 25, 1938. I believe you are the son of merchants.
Sí, mis padres tenían juntos una
Yes, my parents ran a women's clothing store together.
tienda de ropas por mujeres.
Women's clothing, yes. And it is also said that you studied Spanish at the University of Granada. That is true, yes. I was at a school in England and I had a scholarship. That's what it's called.
Se llama bolso.
A grant. Yes, yes.
Y incluido era un parágrafo.
And included was a paragraph allowing this student to finish or complete their studies with a course in a foreign country of their choice.
Un curso en país extranjero. de su elección. Yo tenía un muy gran interés, no de... lo admito, no
I had a very great interest, I don't admit it, not in the Spanish language, but in bullfighting, and that's why I absolutely wanted to leave school and came to Spain to follow the bulls.
Y venía a España por seguir los toros.
Following the bulls, yes. That I learned Spanish, but not in a classroom, in a classroom.
More than in the classrooms, right? Well, I think, yes, more commonly than if I had spent 4 months in 1956 from January to April in a classroom. Yes, there was possibly a more classical, more literary knowledge of the Spanish language.
Más literario del idioma español, pero corriendo con otros teenagers.
But running around with other teenagers from Malaga after the bullfighters, yes, I did learn, but I learned an Andalusian street language that did not impress my teachers.
Que no impresionaba a mis profesores.
And that curiosity that you felt about bullfighting, where did it come from?
De un libro, La muerte por la tarde, por Hemingway, que
From a book Death in the Afternoon by Heming White that I had read when I was 15 in England, and to me I thought absolutely I wanted to see this extraordinary festival that for an Englishman is so strange. No, there is nothing like bullfighting in England.
no existía nada como la corrida de toros en Inglaterra. Y yo supongo mi
And I suppose my imagination was fascinated by the prospect of seeing this spectacle.
espectáculo.
You enjoyed the spectacle enormously.
And what's around, backstage too.
Yes, the
Atmosphere. When I was
17 años,
17, the bull ring was fascinating to me.
El toril, donde secuestran
Where are the bulls held before the bullfight?
de la corrida, de
Being invited to have a drink with a,
un
matador, an incredible matador. What other languages did you study? Where else?
languages. Sorry. My.
First language was French.
Mis padres tenían amigos franceses.
My parents had French friends, and after the war, whenever it was possible to travel, I spent my January summer holidays with this French family every year.
Verano con esta familia francesa.
It turns out that when I was 13, I spoke French well, quite well.
Enseguida alemán,
German right away, then Russian at school where I was, then Spanish, and during my military service I tried to learn Italian.
y en mi servicio militar he intentado de aprender italiano. Entonces,
So, around 5 years old, at 17, it seems that you were a pilot in the Royal Air Force, and they say you were the youngest pilot in the British Air Force.
Yes. Why so soon?
Pero, mire, en estos días era necesario por cada joven británico de hacer un servicio militar. Normalmente
But look, in those days it was necessary for every young Briton to do military service, is usually at the age of 18.
la escuela.
When I was out of school, I had been here for a year and 6 months, 8 months, and my father told me that he absolutely would not tolerate me, that I wasted my time, and so, by special exception, they admitted me at 17 years and 6 months.
Entonces, por excepción especial, me admitan a los 17 años y 6 meses.
It turns out that 2 years later I was younger than all the others in the same class, who were 20 years old. I was 19 years old.
Por eso, cuando nos
That's why when they gave us pilots' wings, I was the youngest, but it was a coincidence, nothing important.
Were you a pilot by vocation? No. It was the second thing that fascinated me, after bullfighting.
después los toros volar.
After bullfighting, flying, piloting airplanes, and I had books on airplanes that I had completely memorized. All the hunters in the world.
Todos los cazadores del mundo podía reconocer
I could recognize in 10% of a second, 10% of a second.
por ciento de un segundo. Era un
It was an exercise, by their plane.
plano.
All the hunters, American, French, Soviet, British, all of them.
A tenth of a second was enough to distinguish what kind of plane that fighter plane was that was passing through the air. Yes, because for a fighter pilot it is necessary to recognize before shooting if it is his or the enemy's. How did you later feel attracted to the journalistic profession? Because you had the possibility of continuing as an officer in the Royal Air Force, military aviation, or of leaving it and moving on to another career. I calculated that if I had stayed in aviation for 12 more years, I would have left at the age of 32 with no profession other than pilot.
Sin profesión, aparte piloto.
And it seemed more interesting to me to leave aviation and try something else. My third interest was to travel, 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 travel. And I thought that being a correspondent in foreign countries would be a way of traveling with the editor paying my ticket. You have met many mercenaries. Many, a dozen, possibly 15 professionals. How do you see them? What kind of people are mercenaries? It
Is almost unclassifiable. Unclassifiable. They are all different, aren't they?
Yes, it is that I know that there is an image of the mercenary in the press. Yes, he is always a very bad guy. Inspiration, money alone.
En mi experiencia, el dinero no era la motivación primordial.
In my experience, money was not the primary motivation, because what they earned, for example, in Biafra was much less than what they could have earned. For example, working in an oil field where the pay is quite high, right? It was more complicated. They came from different births, from different parents, from different nations, different languages, different guides. And the only thing they all had in common was the love of fighting, not sadism. Two were sadists, but others were no more evil, no more cruel than any people in a paratrooper regime, but they had this love of
adventure.
Laura, fighting as a soldier, not as a murderer.
When you finish Shackle, however, even though the book was like an explosion, you have a hard time finding a publisher. You go to one and they say no, the second one neither, nor the third, nor the fourth. Yes. Eventually, I don't know. I think they weren't reading it. It's normal when an author without a well-known name submits a manuscript. He is one of 100. One among many, because there are manuscripts arriving at the door of every major publisher every day, every week. Lots. And most of them are unpublishable.
Of course. So mine was no different.
How many copies do you estimate have been sold of Shackle in the world? The publishers tell me around 8 to 9 million. There we have the second book, which is Odessa. Odessa, for which book Federico conducts a long investigation into the activities of the surviving Nazis. How do you do that research? How do you come to know that there is an organization that protects, so to speak, all the Nazis who have escaped the purges and the repressions of the post-war period? I started with an idea of just one topic. It reminded me, for example, of the case of Amman, Adolfan, who escaped from prison. Argentina was kidnapped by an Israeli commando in 1960 and hanged in Jerusalem in 1961. And the idea came to me, how these professional hunters or amateurs of ex-Nazis live.
Y claro, sin mucho
Well,
retraso,
I started investigating and of course, without much delay I found myself at the door of Simon Wiesel in Vienna, who helped me a lot and who explained to me how they were taken out of Germany at the end of the war, knowing that they were being hunted.
Me explicó cómo son salidos de Alemania a la fin de la guerra, sabiendo que estaban cazados, cómo pasan por esto.
Well, how they got through this goes all the way to Rimini and from Europe to most of Latin America, Argentina, Paraguay.
La mayoría América Latina, Argentina, Paraguay.
My sources of information
Fuentes de información estaban la administración
were the administration of the government of West Germany to Ludwigsburg Simon Besentel himself, and another one that I can't say who he is, who he was.
otro que no puedo decir quién es, quién fue. Y desde ellos estas fuentes.
And from there, they explained to me that Rossmann, for example, that one of my sources suggested to me instead of using a fictional Nazi, Freddy, why not choose a real Nazi?
De utilizar un nazi ficcional, ¿por qué no elegir un nazi real?
I asked, is it possible? Yes, of course, it is possible, because there is, for example, and Rossmann suggested it to me. Rossmann was not an amateur.
Rossmann era exactamente como descrito en este libro. Y es una ironía, una de las ironías de la vida.
Rossmann was exactly, as described in this book, and it is an irony, one of the ironies of life, that finally the film Odessa, was shown in a cinema in a small town in Argentina, and one of Rossmann's neighbors recognized him from the film and, picked up the phone and called the police.
Reconoció de la película y tomó el teléfono y ha telefonado a la policía. Rossmann era aprehendido, dejado libre en libertad.
Rossmann was arrested, released on parole, but he, was going to Paraguay and in 2.5 years ago he died of a heart attack and is now buried in Paraguay.
Murió de un infarto y ahora está enterrado en Paraguay.
Odessa, as most of our viewers probably know, is a compound expression of the words or the initials of the German words that are equivalent to an organization of former members of the SS, and its objectives were to rehabilitate them as professionals within the Federal Republic of Germany, to infiltrate the political parties of the new state, paying for defense expenses and influencing trials, introducing survivors into economic areas and facilitating a state of opinion progressively favorable to the former SS. Is it true that this organization exists?
Yes, it
Is true that it has a lot of money. Right now I don't know. It certainly existed, for sure, and it had a lot of money, a lot of economic power. Very rich, very rich. Do you think there are many Nazis still living abroad? There is.
Siempre
always, there is always a, how do you say it?
una comunidad bastante grande en América del Sur.
A fairly large community in South America, but now, 30 years later, 35 years after the end of World War II, those who are actively hunted are, as you say, the cream, the elite.
El elite. Hay posiblemente un docen, posiblemente dos docenes.
There are possibly a dozen, possibly 2 dozen that the German government today does want to prosecute.
Que quiere por hacer un proceso. La mayoría ahora, probablemente que llevan unas.
Most of them are now probably around 70 years old and can only be charged with mass murder.
Asesino en masa. Es posible ahora de inculparlos. Entonces,
So, individual murderers are no longer possible, Frederick tells us. For C, who estimates that there are 1 or 2 dozen at most of the great Nazi leaders still alive. They are all in their 70s or so, and that they would like all those who can be accused of mass murder, and that the German government would still like to have the opportunity to profess them. They say that this book has had the most editions of all his, Odessa.
Yes. No, not in Spain.
En España Chacal ha vendido más, pero
In Spain, Schockel has sold more, but Odessa has enjoyed great success in America, where, for example, the question of Nazis is very popular. If you like, there has also been much talk about the pressures that have been exerted on you, the threats that you have received on various occasions, sometimes from the Nazis themselves, sometimes from the Jewish Mossad. Actually, what kind of pressure have you been under? Have you ever been threatened with death? No.
No. While preparing this book, Odessa, very few threats and not a few.
No, unas cartas extraordinarias.
Extraordinary letters after the launch, and I think that they were all letters from characters on the far right, extreme, and most of them unnamed.
Extreme derecha. Y la mayoría sin nombre.
No, where the position where it was sometimes a little dangerous was preparing for war. This world was more deadly than these old guys of 70 years old.
Much more dangerous, people even younger.
Yes, and probably harder, right?
It was a question of people who were like active operatives.
Yes.
Active at the time of my research and not 30 years before. At the time of the research, they were fully exercising their capacity and their efficiency. You had said that you were going to write 3 novels apparently and then you would stop.
Why? The exercise of writing or the exercise of thinking is really very hard, isn't it? Question mark. The reason why I said this was very simple. After finishing the manuscript of Perros La Guerra, I had prepared and written and launched 3 great novels in 40 months and I was very, very tired. So tired that when a journalist asked me, "So, Frederick, the next one, when will it be?" "It will come out next year at this point." Quote, I said, no, I'm not writing anymore. It's finite, it's terminal, sure. Then 5 years ago, it was 5 years ago, almost to the day. The release of The Dogs of War in the English version was in September of '75 and again, The Devil's Tale. Exactly September 15th, '79. So not 75, but it's The Dogs of War, '79. The new one. So, 4 years between one and the other, it's
been said that The Dogs of War served as the starting point for a scandal in which you were accused by an English newspaper, the Sunday Times I think it was.
You were accused of being involved in a conspiracy.
In a coup d'etat against a country. It seems that there is Equatorial Guinea.
Against Macias. And that you even invested part of your money in this conspiracy.
And it was added, in addition, that you even participated or were part of a naval operation over Guinea, right? Maritime.
Was a hoax, a story, wasn't it? A good story, a good novelistic story from another country, right? There is no truth to it, right? Yes, there is little, there is some truth, in
the sense that there was a plan and you were a witness. There was a plan and you knew about it.
Era testigo. Pero después, el fallo total del plano.
H was a witness, but after the total failure of the plan, I have given my word to the gentlemen, who are involved in the matter, that if they let me know all the details, I will never talk about their EOS or what really happened, and I have my word to this day.
Yo nunca hablaré de EOS ni de lo verdaderamente ha pasado. Y hasta hoy tengo palabra.
But the sad thing is that, apparently, and although this may seem absurd in hindsight, in the light of historical perspective, Guinea would not have gone through such terrible times as those it experienced under Macias if that coup had succeeded, right? This coup plan never had a chance. It had not the slightest chance. Least of a chance. It was destined to fail in any case. Let's move on to the next book, which is Viafras. We've talked about it before. This book of reports, Genesis of an African legend that we've seen before, written in January 1969 in the middle of the Biafra War, where he sticks to reality and where he tries to explain foreign participation in the conflict, which apparently was a conflict of interests, like almost all conflicts, based on the possible existence of an ocean of high-quality oil in Biafra, right? It was more complicated. It was more complicated. It
Was more complicated.
Lo que la inspiración de mi disgusto era que
What inspired my disgust was that the real reasons for the British government sending huge, massive quantities of arms to the dictator in Lagos were not the reasons given to the press, to Parliament, to the British people.
no eran las razones dadas ni a la prensa, ni al Parlamento, ni al pueblo británico.
What were the real reasons?
La egotismo
The egotism of a group of civil servants and politicians in Harold Wilson's government, who had made a miscalculation, a bad calculation, and they could not admit it.
mal cálculo y que no podían admitirlo. Ellos pensaban que esta guerra
They thought that this war would be a 10-day affair and they could not accept that they had made a mistake, which was not the case. It was different. It was completely different.
era diferente, era completamente distinto. En lugar de admitir
Instead of admitting, yes, that we had made a mistake, they adopted a policy.
una política
Yes,
de forzar la teoría
of forcing theory, of forcing reality to pass their theory, and the result was instead of a 10-day war, a 30-month war, instead of a dozen dead, 1.5 million.
días, una guerra de 30 meses, en lugar de un docen de muertos, 1,500,000.
How awful. Let's talk about the 4-year hiatus that passed since he says he finished writing it. It turns out that the first thing he did was get married. Well, they say he made a lot of money with those novels. The people who keep track of other people's money say that it exceeded 300 million pesetas, which he deposited, largely, in Switzerland. It is said that he fell in love with and married a beautiful Irish woman who we have around here in some photos from previous stays in our country. What's her name, madam? Carola, Carola, Carola.
and since then there have been children here too, right?
Yes.
Somos casados en España.
We got married in Spain in 73 and we spent a year in Spain after the wedding.
Un año en España después la boda. Fin de 74.
At the end of 74, we returned to his country, Ireland. We bought a house and in 77 the first of 2 children arrived.
Llega el primer de los dos hijos.
Oh, and recently, last June, the second.
El segundo. Entonces ahora
So, now we have 2 beautiful children. What has Carola contributed to Frederick Forsyth's life?
Una
Coincidentally,
estaba en Londres en 70, antes de toda esa fama y dinero.
I was in London in the 70s, before all that fame and money, and I was at a friend's apartment chatting with her, with him, and she was passing by. I knew the other guy who was a man in his 60s and I came to visit him, and then the introduction made coffee.
Y vine a visitarlo. Y entonces la presentación, ha hecho café. Yo perdió todo interés.
I lost all interest in the old guy and so did he.
Y él también.
Happy. Well, the Forsyth couple's installation in Spain takes place on the Levantine coast in a town called Honduras. And it was said in the newspapers that it was a peasant retreat because Forsyth, since he wasn't going to write anymore, was going to start a rabbit farm. He was going to dedicate himself to rabbit farming. How did it turn out? It was a joke. It was a joke. Not me, I had a dozen rabbits. A dozen rabbits.
A dozen rabbits.
Y con
And with the normal possibility of exaggeration, I had a rabbit farm worth millions and millions and millions, no doubt.
millones y millones. No estaba entonces.
There are many novelists out there who don't write, right? Despite his intentions not to write again in 1979, The Devil's Alternative has now appeared and this time he has already received for it, or so the world press says, £1 million sterling, right? Well, it is possible, yes.
150 million pesetas more or less. Well, yes, more or less.
From this book that you are seeing now on your screens. It seems that this novel was written partly by the decision or the commitment that Carol Forsed put in, or not.
Sí, ella tenía un parte.
Well, yes, she had a part in this decision because I had the idea in my head and it was going around here inside.
Era rodeando aquí dentro. Finalmente ella me dice, mire, Freddy.
Finally, she tells me, "Look, Freddie, you won't be happy until you have written it, because the idea won't leave you and you won't let go of the idea, and it would be a shame if you don't do anything and someone else later writes something similar, because you will never be happy with this either.
Porque nunca tú serás contento de esto tampoco. Entonces,
So, write it."
y ella era
And she was in a state of waiting for the arrival of our first child.
llegada de nuestro primer hijo. Yo le dijiste que era necesario.
I told her that it was necessary to travel and leave her, and her answer was, do it, write it down, because only when it is written can we have a little peace in that house.
Podemos tener un poco paz en esa casa.
The truth is that it is a futuristic work. It is the first work that is not set in the past, but rather that is somewhat confronting the mystery of the immediate future. It all takes place in 1982. It is 500 pages. This is the thick volume, 500 pages of a tight text where the complexity is much greater than in previous novels. If in the others there were, let's say, 3 or 4 parallel plots, here the branches are multiple. There are like 15 different settings.
Right? See no. 5. I have counted Turkey, London, Berlin, Norway, the United States, Holland, Israel. And there are still more, right?
Yes, there are different themes. There, if what happens in London, including the
British spy in Moscow.
Y hay el Politburo en Moscú. Hay el presidente en Washington.
and there are the Ukrainian politicians and the Norwegian captain of the supertanker.
Noruega, del superpetrolero. Entonces,
So, about 5 big themes IP that there are about 5. Big themes, about 5 big stories, and then there are other sub-themes or minor stories.
This is complicated. Your novel has attracted a lot of attention. People's attention because for the first time, in a painful way, the possibility of that tragic alternative of a third world war is being raised. Do you think that war is possible? I don't.
Think so. It's not impossible. The balance of fear, who will dare to break it? No, I don't think about this balance of fear. Not a little, less possibly than some comments. It seems to me that if 2 or 3 conditions coincide by chance in the same month, possibly only one match is missing. Not to start a war, but to set in motion a series of events that lead to a confrontation between America and Russia. And I was writing in October of last year, 15 months ago. But now we see that if, for example, the Terran are killed and if immediately after this the pressures of the American domestic election push the president to respond with force. And if an old man in Tehran, in a state of panic, makes an appeal. An appeal. Yes, Moscow for support. Would it be possible for an American hunter to kill a Soviet hunter in space 13,000 meters above the desert? But this would be very, very dangerous. I'm only talking about a group of students who can't think of anything other than their Shao returning to Iran, setting in motion a series that no one can stop, which continues to a certain point. This is possible. This is the tremendous alternative, the unknown, the question that we have hanging over us and that Frederick Forsyth leaves somewhat open in his book The Devil's Book Alternative. I suppose another novel will come in time because I don't think the author is going to tell us that he's retiring to rest again. Now I think he's raising sheep instead of rabbits over there in Ireland. A dozen, right?
A dozen sheep. Just for the pleasure of having sheep. Pigeons nearby too, I think, so that the children can see how those delightful birds fly. And there's another thing, and that is that it's said, because people always say things, especially journalists who are studying in other people's lives, it is said that Forsyth chose Ireland because it is the only country in the world where writers do not pay taxes. That's what has been said. It has been said, but it is true. Partly, yes, partly.
But I can honestly say that when you and I went to Ireland, I had no intention or ambition to write more. So it was partly, if you want to see, the main part was that my wife is from there, that I wanted to go back, that it is an attractive country, very green, that the people are very friendly was the main reason. Yes, it was an advantage in case I wanted to write later on. More than that, writers have a great advantage from the point of view of taxes. Yes, taxes. Since Forsyth is only 40 years old, 41 years old.
1. It means that he has many books ahead of him and that, in time, we will have to sit down with him again, to continue talking, because he is a very cordial and very nice man who, despite the fact that he only learned a little bit of Spanish following the bullfighters when he was 17 years old, he has been able to be here talking for an entire hour and telling us many things. There are many more in the pipeline for another time. Thank you very much, Federico. Goodbye and good luck. Thank you very much, Juan.